That afternoon, I returned to our Los Angeles recording studio in dead silence. What I found waiting for me in the soundproof booth was my husband, wrapped around his mistress, mocking the greatest tragedy of my life. What I did next, the moment I laid my hands on the main mixing console, would permanently alter the trajectory of two marriages and shatter their world forever. My name is Eleanor Ella to the public. For 15 years, I had been married to Mark Sterling. He wasn't just my husband. He was my lead producer, my manager, the ruthless Hollywood bulldog, and the bedrock upon which we had built my multi-platinum career as a singer, songwriter. That morning in our sprawling Calabasas estate, he had kissed my forehead with practiced affection, claiming he had to fix some crucial vocal stems and would be stuck at the studio late into the night. I trusted him blindly, or at least I thought I did. It wasn't until a sudden, suffocating tightness in my chest, a symptom of the crushing anxiety surrounding my recent psychogenic vocal paralysis, drove me out of the house to seek solace in the one place I always felt safe, our musical sanctuary in Burbank. Stepping into the climate-controlled lobby of the studio complex, I immediately noticed an eerie stillness. The receptionist was out, and the only sound breaking the heavy silence was the muffled echo of breathless laughter seeping through the heavy, soundproofed doors of Studio A. I walked down the dimly lit, acoustic-paneled hallway, my heart hammering against my ribs, each step on the plush carpet feeling like I was wading through wet cement. The massive, steel-reinforced acoustic door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open just a fraction of an inch, and the sight that greeted me sucked the oxygen straight out of my lungs, turning the blood in my veins to ice. Mark was there, leaning against the multi-million-dollar SSL mixing board, passionately entangled with Chloe. Chloe wasn't just a random groupie. She was my personal assistant. The bright-eyed, seemingly innocent 20-something I had personally taken under my wing. I had let her live in our guest house when she first moved to LA. I called her my confidant. She was the one who handed me organic throat coat tea and wiped away my tears when the top otolaryngologists at Cedars-Sinai told me that my golden voice might never return due to severe trauma and stress. But the most devastating part wasn't just seeing them together, casually obliterating a 15-year marriage and a decade of blind loyalty. The worst part was what I heard right before they registered my presence. Chloe, trailing her manicured acrylic nails through my husband's hair, looked up at him with a vicious, mocking smirk. Don't you feel even a little bad for her? Poor, pathetic Ella, locked up in that sprawling house, depressed and completely mute. And Mark, the man I had given my best years, my youth, and the rights to every melody I had ever written, threw his head back and laughed. It was a cruel, guttural sound I had never heard in all our years together. He replied that he felt nothing but exhaustion and pity for me. Her voice is shot. It's completely useless, he scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. You went in, woman. I'm so sick of living with a broken woman, walking on eggshells around a has-been. You, Chloe, you are my real future. You're the inspiration she can't give me anymore. Those words inflicted a kind of agony that no physical blow ever could. In that precise, suspended fraction of a second, all the love, the blind devotion, and the suffocating dependency I felt for that man instantly crystallized into pure, dense, glacial hatred. They still hadn't seen me. They were entirely too consumed with laughing at my misery, building their twisted romance on the smoldering ashes of my life. With an icy, terrifying calm I didn't know I possessed, I took a single step back into the shadow of the control room. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The overwhelming stress of the industry had already stolen my physical voice weeks ago, but my mind was suddenly sharper and clearer than it had been in a decade. I glided silently toward the secondary control rack, which was powered on and mirrored to the main board. I knew this equipment better than the lines on my own face. Without a tremor in my hand, I reached out and hit the master record button, routing the feed from the booth's hot condenser mics directly to a secure, encrypted cloud drive. I captured everything. Every wet kiss, every cruel joke, every filthy promise of their future echoing perfectly through the high-fidelity Neumann microphones. Once the file was safely uploaded, I pulled out my iPhone and scrolled to a very specific contact, David Miller, Chloe's husband. David was a good, hard-working man, a high-end residential contractor who practically worshipped the ground Chloe walked on. I typed out a rapid, uncompromising iMessage. David, come to the Burbank studio right now. There is something in Studio A you need to see and hear with your own eyes before it's too late. Trust me. But before I tell you what happened 15 minutes later when David arrived, pale-faced, chest heaving, his work boots tracking dust onto the pristine floors as he found his wife in my husband's arms, let me rewind. Because the hallway of that recording studio didn't just become the waiting room of hell for those two traitors. It was the birthplace of my ultimate rebirth. My story didn't start on that day of betrayal and open microphones. It started years ago, back when my voice was packing out arenas from Madison Square Garden to the Hollywood Bowl, and my heart still believed in the fairy tales the music industry sold. Mark and I had started from absolute rock bottom. We were two kids playing sticky-floored dive bars in East Nashville, scraping together tip money just to buy our first decent Shure microphone. I brought the raw talent. He brought the relentless ambition. Together, we thought we were invincible. But when the massive success hit, so did the crushing pressure. The endless cross-country tours, the grueling press junkets, the demanding label executives, and the extreme physical exhaustion. That was when Chloe infiltrated our lives. She presented herself as a humble, eager superfan from the Midwest who desperately needed an entry-level gig in Los Angeles. I, naive and bursting with maternal instinct, took her under my wing. I taught her the ropes of the industry, opened the doors of my inner circle to her, and let her into my private life. She became my shadow, organizing my chaotic Apple calendar, fetching my iced matches before every stadium gig, and flashing me that sickly sweet smile that I now recognize as pure, concentrated venom. David, her husband, used to come to the studio to pick her up in his beat-up Ford F-150. He was a man with honest, transparent eyes and hands rough, from working framing jobs on LA construction sites. He looked at Chloe like she hung the moon and the stars. God, how blind David and I both were. What perfect, trusting victims we made for their sick, twisted game. Eventually, the suffocating pressure of being Ella the superstar began to strangle me. I developed a constant, agonizing knot in my throat, a physical manifestation of severe anxiety. The specialists in Beverly Hills diagnosed it as acute vocal fold paresis, triggered by extreme psychological distress. One night, in the middle of a sold-out show at the Staples Center, I stood in front of 20,000 screaming fans, opened my mouth to hit the chorus, and absolutely nothing came out. It was the most terrifying, humiliating moment of my existence. That psychogenic vocal paralysis plunged me into a dark, suffocating silence. For weeks, I locked myself in our master bedroom, mourning the death of my identity. Mark would sit at the edge of the bed, telling me it would all be fine, insisting I just needed rest, while Chloe would hold my hand, looking into my eyes and promising she would take care of everything. And boy, did they take care of everything. They hijacked my studio, my husband, and my dignity. But as the digital timecode on the recording software rolled on, capturing their betrayal in flawless high definition, I knew with absolute certainty that my silence would not be my grave. It would be my most lethal weapon. The digital clock on the studio wall ticked by with agonizing slowness. I remained standing, cloaked in the shadows of the hallway, my phone gripped tightly in my hand. My breathing was slow, deliberate, almost non-existent. The tears had completely dried up. Tears are for victims, and the exact second I heard my husband laugh at my trauma, I stopped being a victim. Exactly 15 minutes after I hit send on that text message, I heard the heavy front doors of the studio complex slam open. Fast, heavy footsteps pounded against the polished concrete of the lobby, transitioning to the carpet of the hallway. It was David. He appeared at the end of the corridor, his denim work jeans and Carhartt jacket covered in white drywall dust, his hair disheveled, his face completely drained of color from sheer panic. Seeing me standing there in the gloom, he stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes were wild, reflecting a chaotic storm of fear and confusion. He closed the distance between us with shaky, hesitant steps. He looked deep into my eyes, silently begging for an explanation. He wanted me to tell him it was a false alarm, a misunderstanding, just an exaggeration from my stress-addled brain. But my face was a mask of carved marble. I couldn't speak to tell him the truth. My vocal cords were still locked tight in their trauma-induced prison, so I simply raised my hand and pointed a trembling finger toward the heavy acoustic door of Studio A. David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths. He took a step toward the door, and I followed closely behind him, with his heart undoubtedly pounding a deafening rhythm in his ears, but his demeanor terrifyingly cold. David slammed his hand against the heavy door, pushing it wide open. The heavy thud of the door hitting the soundproofed wall echoed violently inside the room. Mark and Chloe, still deeply engrossed in their clandestine makeout session, jumped out of their skins and broke apart as if they had been struck by lightning. The scene was intensely pathetic. Chloe, her cheap fast-fashion blouse unbuttoned, her face flushed crimson with sudden, crushing shame, tried to clumsily cover herself, stumbling backward until she knocked over a $3,000 mic stand. Mark, the untouchable, arrogant mega-producer, the man who controlled every narrative and contract in my life, froze completely. His jaw went slack, his mouth hanging open like a dying fish, utterly incapable of forming a single coherent syllable. Pure, unadulterated terror flooded his eyes as he took in David's imposing, broad-shouldered frame filling the doorway. David didn't scream. He didn't throw a punch. His reaction was infinitely more heartbreaking. He just stood there, staring at them in a sepulchral, suffocating silence, as if his brain was completely short-circuiting, unable to process the visceral reality of his wife's betrayal. Chloe, trembling violently, took a tentative step toward him. David. David. Honey. Please, let me explain, she whimpered, her voice suddenly high-pitched and reeking of desperation. It was the exact same voice that, mere minutes ago, had been dripping with venom while mocking my depression. It's not what it looks like. David slowly raised a single, calloused hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. His eyes were hollow, dead. The warm, radiant light of unconditional love he always reserved for her had been permanently extinguished. I took a step forward, stepping out of the shadows and fully into the bright LED lights of the studio. Seeing me, Mark somehow grew even paler. Ella, my husband choked out, his voice cracking, revealing the absolute panic constricting his throat. Ella, baby. She came on to me. I swear to God, it was just a stupid, meaningless mistake. I smiled. It was a terrifying, hollow smile devoid of any human warmth. I walked slowly past them, straight toward the massive SSL console. They watched me, confused and terrified. Because I was mute, they assumed I was defenseless. They thought my silence equated to total weakness. God, they were so wrong. I leaned over the board and seamlessly routed the high-res audio file I had just recorded directly into the studio's main playback system, the towering, custom-built ATC reference monitors designed to blast final masters at stadium-level volumes. I grabbed the master volume fader, shoved it all the way to the maximum, and slammed the spacebar to hit play. Instantly, Chloe's voice exploded through the room, the state-of-the-art subwoofers shaking the floorboards. Don't you feel even a little bad for her? Poor, pathetic Ella. And then, Mark's cruel, arrogant laughter reverberated through every inch of the acoustic foam, hitting them like physical blows. Her voice is shot. It's completely useless. I'm so sick of living with a broken woman. You, Chloe, you are my real future. The impact of the high-fidelity playback was apocalyptic. Mark slammed his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut, physically unable to endure the deafening sound of his own vile narcissism. Chloe broke down entirely, collapsing to her knees on the expensive Persian rug, sobbing and violently dry-heaving, gasping out apologies that literally no one in the room wanted to hear. David clenched his fists at his sides. His knuckles turned stark white under the strain. A single, solitary tear escaped his eye, tracking through the drywall dust on his weathered cheek. Without saying a single word to the woman he had vowed to love forever, without sparing a second glance at the millionaire producer who had ruined his life, David slowly turned his back on them. He walked over to me. He looked down into my eyes. And in that split second of shared, catastrophic grief, an unspoken, indestructible pact was forged between us. We didn't need words or grand declarations to understand that our lives had just been nuked by the exact same villains, and that somehow, together, we were going to sift through the radioactive fallout and rebuild. With a level of chivalry and dignity that sharply contrasted with the gutter trash we were leaving behind, David offered me his arm. I took it without a microsecond of hesitation. We walked out of Studio A together, leaving Mark and Chloe trapped in a prison of their own making, drowning in the deafening, looped playback of their own toxic betrayal, which I had set to repeat infinitely. The harsh, smoggy afternoon heat of Los Angeles hit my face as we pushed through the glass doors onto the pavement. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I took a long, deep breath, letting the Pacific breeze fill my lungs. David walked beside me in absolute silence, his eyes fixed on the distant Hollywood hills, his mind slowly, painfully processing the total annihilation of his marriage and his home. Even though I couldn't make a single sound, I felt something new, ferocious, and terrifyingly powerful, igniting deep within my core. My vocal cords were still locked, yes, but my mind was roaring like a caged lion tasting blood. We walked aimlessly through the busy streets of Burbank for what felt like hours, ignoring the stares of passers-by, until we finally collapsed onto a secluded wooden bench in Griffith Park. We sat there, side by side, watching the LA sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange before surrendering to the cold, encroaching darkness. It was the most heartbreakingly perfect metaphor for what had just happened to our lives. Yet, sitting there in the dark, David and I found a profound, unexpected solace in each other's presence. He turned to me, his eyes catching the amber glow of a nearby street lamp, and his voice was thick with raw emotion. "We are not going to let this sink us, Ella," he vowed, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I swear to God, we are never giving them the satisfaction of watching us drown." I nodded slowly, a cold, unbreakable determination settling into my features. The silence that wrapped around me was no longer a tragic medical condition imposed by stress and heartbreak. It had transmuted. It was now an impenetrable shield of titanium, and it was going to be the instrument of their destruction. They had foolishly assumed that by taking my voice, they had stripped me of all my power. Instead, they had just awakened a woman willing to burn down the entire music industry to reclaim every single inch of her stolen dignity. As the grid of Los Angeles city lights flickered to life below us, I began to meticulously map out the first stage of a revenge so elegant, so cold-blooded, and so absolute, it would make Hollywood history. They genuinely had no idea the hellfire that was about to rain down upon them. The days following that fateful afternoon were a chaotic blur of aggressive Century City divorce attorneys, sterile legal documents, and a dull, throbbing pain that refused to let go of my chest. Mark, in a frantic, pathetic scramble to salvage his pristine public image and his rapidly freezing bank accounts, tried to contact me through every conceivable channel. He blew up my phone with desperate voicemails, sent massive bouquets of white roses to my lawyer's office, and drafted excruciatingly long emails full of cheap, manipulative excuses. He claimed the insurmountable pressure of my medical condition had pushed him to seek comfort, that I was his ultimate muse, and that his music had no soul without me. Reading his words literally made me nauseous. I didn't reply to a single one. My lawyer, a shark-like litigator who charged $1,000 an hour, built an impenetrable fortress around me. I moved out of the Calabasas mansion and leased a discreet, highly secured beachfront condo in Santa Monica, far away from the paparazzi who were already starting to smell the blood in the water regarding my sudden absence from the public eye. David, for his part, executed his exit with similar ruthlessness. Chloe had begged on her hands and knees in their driveway, screaming hysterically as he packed his tools and his clothes into his truck that very night. He drove away, leaving her sobbing on the manicured lawn of the suburban house he had spent 3 years remodeling for her. Fate, with its bizarre, invisible threads, continually drew David and me together. We found ourselves meeting at the same quiet, out-of-the-way diner in the San Fernando Valley almost every single day. At first, we just sat in a heavy, shared silence, nursing bitter black coffee, and feeling the crushing weight of our respective disappointments. Slowly, he started to open up. He told me how Chloe, in a panic, had attempted to drain one of their joint savings accounts before he could get the bank to freeze it. I listened to him with laser focus, reading his lips when the diner got too loud, nodding gently, offering him my steadfast presence as his only sanctuary. I couldn't offer him verbal advice, but my eyes conveyed every ounce of empathy and solidarity he needed. Gradually, those quiet coffee dates evolved into long, sprawling, one-sided conversations. David would talk, and I would respond by scribbling rapid, witty replies in a small, leather-bound moleskine notebook I carried everywhere. Through the ink on those pages, I discovered an incredibly profound man hiding behind those rough, calloused hands. I learned that he was an avid reader of architectural history, that he harbored a lifelong dream of launching his own elite construction and acoustic design firm, and that he possessed a well of patience that seemed bottomless. He never, not once, looked at me with the sickening, condescending pity I had loathed in Mark's eyes. David looked at me with deep, inherent respect. He viewed my silence not as a handicap, but as a space he was honored to share. He made me feel human again. One late afternoon, as we were walking barefoot along the wet sand in Malibu, the salty Pacific wind whipping around us, he stopped. He turned to face me, reached out, and took both of my trembling hands into his large, warm ones. "Ella," he said, his voice so incredibly soft it sent a shiver racing down my spine. "You didn't deserve a single second of what that bastard put you through. You are, without a doubt, the strongest woman I have ever met." That simple, grounding touch, that singular moment of pure, unadulterated validation, ignited a spark deep inside the darkest cavern of my soul. Meanwhile, my intense vocal therapy sessions in Beverly Hills continued. The top-tier specialist had thoroughly explained that my vocal cords were physically flawless. The paralysis was entirely psychosomatic, a massive neurological block triggered by the toxic, emotionally abusive environment I had been drowning in for years. Now that Mark's suffocating manipulation and Chloe's passive-aggressive poison were completely eradicated from my daily life, I began to feel bizarre, painful twitches in my larynx. They felt like tiny, sharp electric shocks. The doctor called them vital signs, proof that my nervous system was attempting to reboot my voice. Alone in my Santa Monica condo, staring out at the crashing waves, I would practice my exercises. At first, all I could manage were broken, pathetic wheezes and strangled, breathless grunts that left me collapsing onto the hardwood floor in tears of absolute frustration. But I refused to quit. The molten rage I harbored toward Mark and Chloe became high-octane fuel. I didn't want to sing for the fame anymore. I didn't want the Billboard charts or the Grammy hardware. I wanted my voice back solely so it could become the whip that flogged them in the public square. Simultaneously, the legal bloodbath of my divorce was reaching its climax. Mark, arrogant to the bitter end, tried to play hardball. He demanded sole ownership of the Burbank studio complex and a 50% cut of the publishing rights to my entire back catalog. His high-priced lawyers argued that he had crafted my sound, and without his genius production, I was just another pretty face with a guitar. That was the exact moment I handed my lawyer the encrypted flash drive containing the recording from that afternoon. My lawyer bluntly reminded me that in California, secretly recording a private conversation is technically inadmissible in court. But we didn't need a judge. We were playing for the court of public opinion. The audio was accompanied by a meticulously documented timeline my lawyer had built, proving severe psychological and emotional abuse. Furthermore, the recording exposed Mark admitting to embezzling studio funds to buy Chloe a sports car. It didn't matter if it was legally admissible. It was a PR death sentence. When Mark's smarmy lawyer hit play on that file during our preliminary mediation in a sterile, glass-walled conference room, I sat perfectly still and watched Mark's entire world implode. All the color drained from his artificially tanned face. He knew, with absolute, terrifying clarity, that if I leaked that audio to TMZ, Rolling Stone, or Twitter, the cancel culture machine would chew him up and spit him out. His career as a respected, family-friendly pop producer would be instantly, violently terminated. The industry would blacklist him before lunchtime. Cornered, humiliated, and terrified of the court of public opinion, Mark caved completely. He signed an ironclad settlement. I walked away with 100% ownership of the Burbank studio, the unassailable master rights to every song I had ever written, and a staggering financial buyout that effectively drained his liquid assets and left him teetering on the absolute edge of bankruptcy. Chloe, witnessing the rapid evaporation of Mark's Hollywood power in his bank accounts, immediately showed her true parasitic colors. She began complaining incessantly, throwing massive tantrums over maxed-out platinum cards, demanding the luxury lifestyle of private jets and Nobu dinners that Mark could no longer provide. Their epic romance quickly devolved into a claustrophobic nightmare of screaming matches, past due notices, and toxic resentment. And I, safely observing from the serene balcony of my new life, watched their pathetic house of cards collapse into the dirt. But my true, earth-shattering victory was still gestating. One hazy Tuesday morning, I woke up and immediately felt a strange, airy lightness in my chest. I walked slowly into the marble bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink. I stared deeply into my own eyes in the mirror. I took a massive breath, filling my diaphragm, closed my eyes, and tried to hum a simple, low C note, praying for a miracle. A soft, trembling vibration escaped my lips. My eyes snapped open. I gasped, stumbling backward, completely unable to process what had just happened. The sound had been incredibly weak, fragile as sponge sugar, but it was there. It was my voice. I slapped my hands over my throat, feeling the faint, miraculous vibration of my vocal cords. Cords that had been entombed in trauma for over 8 months. Tears hot, heavy, and uncontrollable spilled over my eyelashes and cascaded down my cheeks. They weren't tears of sorrow. They were drops of a joy so violently intense, I thought my ribcage was going to shatter. I took another deep breath, bracing myself, and pushed out another note. Firmer this time. Clearer. The miracle was holding. The psychological dam that had kept me a prisoner in my own body was finally cracking wide open, flooding my world with brilliant, blinding light. My heart instantly screamed a single name: David. I grabbed my iPhone with violently shaking hands and dialed his number. The ringing tone echoed in my ear like a ticking bomb. He picked up on the second ring, his deep, comforting voice washing over me like a warm blanket. "Hey, Ella," he said casually, clearly waiting for the familiar ping of an iMessage to follow, assuming I was communicating in our usual way. I closed my eyes, summoned every single ounce of courage residing in my fractured soul, and pushed the air through my healed throat. David. It was barely a whisper, a raspy, fragile thread of sound, but it carried the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. There was dead silence on the other end of the line. A silence so profound, so absolute, that I could hear his sharp, hitched intake of breath. "Ella?" he asked, his voice completely shattering with shock and emotion. Is that really you?" "Yes," I breathed, a wet, breathless sob of pure euphoria accompanying the word. I heard a loud clatter on his end, the sound of him dropping whatever heavy tool he was holding onto a wooden floor, followed by a breathless, incredulous laugh that filled the speaker. "I'm on my way. Don't you move a single muscle," he ordered, before abruptly hanging up. When David burst through the door of my condo 20 minutes later, looking like he had broken every speed limit on the PCH, we didn't need words. He crossed the room in 3 massive strides, wrapped his arms around my waist, and lifted me completely off the ground. He held me with a desperate, crushing strength that made me feel like the most protected, cherished woman on the planet. We stood in the middle of my sun-drenched living room, holding each other and crying openly, celebrating the monumental victory that belonged solely to us. From that morning onward, my recovery accelerated at a blistering pace. My voice didn't just return, it came back transformed. The trauma, the silence, and the heartbreak had aged it like fine wine, adding a rich, smoky depth and a haunting resonance that simply wasn't there before. The pain had fundamentally altered my instrument, weaving itself into every note I sang. David was by my side through every grueling vocal exercise. He was the one brewing the Manuka honey tea, the one clapping wildly when I hit a high octave without my voice breaking, the one looking at me with a love so profound, genuine, and unconditional that it cauterized every lingering wound Mark had ever inflicted. That alliance, born in the ashes of betrayal and forged in the fires of mutual trauma, blossomed naturally into a mature, deeply rooted romance. He was my unshakable foundation, and I was his ultimate peace. While our love grew exponentially in the quiet warmth of our shared life, Mark and Chloe's existence was spiraling rapidly into a pathetic abyss of squalor and regret. Through the grapevine of industry insiders who still respected me, I was drip-fed the delicious details of their demise. Mark, stripped of my talent, my catalog, and the Burbank studio, had desperately tried to rebrand himself by producing Chloe. Chloe had always harbored a secret, delusional fantasy of being a pop star, of stepping into the spotlight she felt I had hogged. But reality is a cruel mistress. Chloe had absolutely zero talent. Her voice was flat, reedy, completely devoid of soul, and heavily dependent on aggressive auto-tune. The major label A&R execs who used to kiss Mark's ring when he was my producer now wouldn't even validate his parking. They laughed him out of boardrooms in Hollywood and New York. In a final desperate gamble, Mark liquidated the last of his remaining credit to self-fund and independently release a single for Chloe. It was a catastrophic failure. The brutal LA music bloggers tore it to shreds. The public completely ignored it. Spotify playlists wouldn't touch it. The financial ruin finally closed in, suffocating them without an ounce of mercy. The extreme financial stress ripped away the glamorous facade of their relationship, exposing the rotting core beneath. Neighbors in their cheap, run-down apartment complex in Van Nuys called the LAPD constantly, reporting their vicious, glass-shattering screaming matches at 3 in the morning. The grand, epic love they had destroyed our lives for was nothing more than a cheap, plastic illusion built entirely on narcissism and greed. I, on the other hand, was meticulously plotting my resurrection with the cold, calculated precision of an assassin. I didn't utter a single word to the press. I didn't post on Instagram. I kept my miraculous recovery locked down under the strictest non-disclosure agreements in the history of Los Angeles. I wanted my comeback to be a seismic event, a nuclear detonation that no one, especially Mark, could possibly see coming. David and I married quietly, in a private, breathtakingly beautiful ceremony on a cliffside in Big Sur, miles away from the flashing cameras of the paparazzi. It was just the two of us, exchanging vows of eternal loyalty against the backdrop of the crashing Pacific Ocean. He restored my shattered faith in men and in the concept of genuine commitment. With my spirit completely renewed and my incredible husband standing like a fortress behind me, I began writing the music for my new album. Every single lyric I penned was an elegant, poison-tipped dart. Every melody was an undeniable flex of my resurrected, turbocharged vocal range. I was finally ready to step out of the shadows and reclaim the iron throne of the music industry that was rightfully mine. I knew the exact time, the exact place, and the exact method I would use to deliver the killing blow to the ghosts of my past. The Burbank recording studio, my studio, became my bunker. For 8 solid weeks, I locked myself inside Studio A with a tiny, heavily vetted group of elite session musicians and engineers. These were people who had been in the trenches with me since day one, people who swore on their lives to keep the secret of my return. Recording that album was the most painful, cathartic, aggressively beautiful process I have ever endured. Every time I stepped up to the vintage Neumann microphone, I closed my eyes and vividly recalled the sound of Mark and Chloe's mocking laughter echoing off those exact same acoustic panels. I remembered the vile contempt in his voice, the suffocating darkness of the silence they had shoved me into. But instead of letting those memories drag me back under, I weaponized them. I alchemized the betrayal, the deep humiliation, and the agonizing despair into musical arrangements of unparalleled purity and devastating power. My voice, which had once been famous for being sweet and radio-friendly, now possessed a raw, gravelly tier that raised the hairs on the arms of everyone in the control room. The lyrics didn't whine or complain. They spoke of plummeting into the absolute void, of torching the bridges of a toxic past, and of crawling out of the ashes wearing a crown woven from hellfire. I never once mentioned their names. That would have given those cockroaches entirely too much credit. The most exquisite, lethal form of revenge is the kind draped in undeniable high art, not the kind found in the cheap gossip columns of a tabloid magazine. David was there for every single session, sitting quietly on the leather sofa at the back of the control room, watching me with absolute awe. When I tracked the lead single, a soaring, earth-shattering power ballad about a woman who meticulously rebuilds her empire from the rubble of a betrayal, I looked through the soundproof glass and saw tears of pure, unadulterated pride streaming down my husband's face. He understood the agonizing weight of every single syllable, because he too had been forced to sweep up the shattered pieces of his own heart, broken by the very woman who had sworn to protect it. Once the final tracks were mixed and sent off to mastering, I knew with bone-deep certainty that I held a masterpiece in my hands. This wasn't just a comeback album. This was a cultural reset. But I refused to drop it casually on a random Friday like an artist begging for relevance. I needed the ultimate stage. I needed the perfect co-conspirator. That was when I picked up the phone and called Arthur "Artie" Carmichael, the legendary, cutthroat CEO of the biggest major record label in the world, based right in the heart of Hollywood. Artie was a grizzled industry veteran, a ruthless shark in the boardroom, but a man who possessed an infallible ear for generational talent. He had always treated me with profound respect, and more importantly, he had always secretly despised Mark's flashy, obnoxious arrogance. I invited Artie to a hyper-secure private listening session at my studio, demanding he sign a draconian NDA before entering the building. When the impeccably dressed, silver-haired executive sat down in the plush leather chair at the mixing console, his expression was a mask of compassionate skepticism. He undoubtedly believed he was about to endure the tragic, breathless screeching of a washed-up star who couldn't accept that her 15 minutes of fame had expired. I poured him a generous glass of vintage Napa Valley Cabernet, flashed him a serene, confident smile, pressed the spacebar on the Mac Pro, and leaned back against the wall to watch the show. The haunting, cinematic opening chords filled the meticulously treated room, and then my voice dropped in, tearing through the silence with a raw, supernatural force that practically shook the walls. Artie dropped his wineglass. The expensive crystal shattered against the hardwood floor, splashing dark red wine everywhere like a crime scene. But the legendary executive didn't even flinch. He didn't look down. He sat completely paralyzed, his jaw tight, his eyes glued to the studio monitors, listening to the entire 4-minute track without taking a single breath. When the final note faded into a haunting silence, the room hummed with residual electricity. Artie slowly reached up and wiped a rogue tear from his weathered cheek. He turned his chair to look at me, staring as if he were witnessing a literal resurrection. "Ella," he whispered, his voice incredibly hoarse, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what he had just heard. We all thought we lost you to the dark. But what I just heard? God Almighty. This is the album of the decade. You aren't just back, kid. You're back to take the entire crown." We didn't waste a single second. That very afternoon, I signed an exclusive, unprecedented global distribution and touring contract. It was an astronomical, multi-million-dollar deal that absolutely dwarfed any contract Mark had ever managed to negotiate for me in his prime. But I forced Artie to write one non-negotiable clause in blood into the legal paperwork. The release of the album, and the fact that I had my voice back, had to remain an absolute, watertight secret until the night of the National Music Gala. The gala was the American music industry's most prestigious, highly televised event of the year, the equivalent of the Grammys held at the massive Crypto.com arena in downtown LA, and it was exactly 1 month away. I wanted my return to be an ambush, a shockwave that would knock the entire planet off its axis. Artie, a master of PR manipulation, grinned like a villain, rubbing his hands together in sheer delight at the brilliance of the marketing strategy. While Artie and I prepared to launch a nuke, back down in the dirt, life was grinding Mark and Chloe into fine powder. Drowning in massive debt, blacklisted by the industry, and constantly facing eviction from their cramped San Fernando Valley apartment, they were living in a state of perpetual, frantic desperation. The bank was threatening to repossess the cheap leased sedan they shared. Chloe screamed at Mark daily, blaming him for nuking her youth and potential, while Mark viciously fired back that she was a tone-deaf anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. They were burning alive in the very hell they had so arrogantly constructed. But narcissism is a terminal disease. Mark's ego simply could not accept his new reality as an industry pariah. Clinging desperately to the evaporating fumes of his former glory, he burned every last bridge and called in a dozen old favors just to secure 2 pity invites to the National Music Gala. In his delusional, desperate mind, he believed that if he could just get into that VIP room, if he could just rub shoulders with the heavyweights, he could pitch Chloe's terrible demo and secure a lifeline. The poor, stupid bastard had no idea that by fighting so hard to get those tickets, he was purchasing front-row seats to his own public execution. The night of the National Music Gala finally arrived, wrapping Los Angeles in a blanket of electric, buzzing anticipation. The city seemed to vibrate with a specific frequency, as if the universe itself knew that history was about to be written on that stage. Inside the sprawling penthouse suite of the Beverly Hills Hotel, standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror, I was preparing for my coronation. There was absolutely no trace left of the terrified, mute, broken woman I had been a year ago. Artie's elite team of celebrity stylists had flown in a custom-made, jaw-dropping gown for me. It was deep, blood-red silk, the exact color of vengeance, of fire, and of the new life surging forcefully through my veins. It fit like liquid armor, projecting an intimidating, untouchable aura of supreme confidence. My dark hair fell in perfect, classic Hollywood waves over my bare shoulders, and my makeup highlighted eyes that had stared down the devil and won. David sat quietly in a velvet armchair behind me, nursing a glass of scotch, watching me with a look of pure, unadulterated reverence that almost brought tears to my eyes. He stood up, looking devastatingly handsome in a tailored, midnight blue Tom Ford tuxedo, and walked up behind me. Gently, he fastened a heavy, breathtaking diamond collar around my neck. "Are you ready, my queen?" he murmured, his breath warm against my ear, pressing a firm, reassuring kiss onto my exposed shoulder. "Tonight, the world remembers who you are." I met his gaze in the mirror, placed my hand over his, and nodded. Yes, I was more than ready. Meanwhile, 20 miles away in a grimy apartment complex, the scene was a portrait of pure tragedy. Mark and Chloe were getting ready amidst a sea of final notice utility bills and empty bottom-shelf wine bottles. Chloe was struggling to zip herself into a tacky, aggressively sequined fast-fashion dress she had bought on clearance. It was far too tight, desperately trying to compensate for her lack of actual star power with sheer tackiness. She stared at her reflection with bitter frustration, cursing the fact that they couldn't afford a professional glam squad. Mark was suffocating in an outdated, slightly ill-fitting Armani suit from 5 years ago, a suit that highlighted the stress-induced weight he had gained and the deep, exhausted lines etched into his face. They bickered venomously as they headed out the door. He ordered her to smile and act like somebody, while she screamed that if he were actually a competent producer, they wouldn't have to take a budget Uber X to the biggest red carpet event of the year. They walked directly into the slaughterhouse, armed with nothing but the blind, staggering arrogance of the truly foolish. The atmosphere outside the massive downtown LA arena was pure chaos. The red carpet was a blinding strobe light of paparazzi flashes, shouting reporters, and screaming fans. The industry's elite, the platinum-selling pop stars, the billionaire label executives, the hit-making producers strutted past the cameras, exchanging fake air kisses and rehearsed sound bites. Mark and Chloe arrived via the chaotic general admission drop-off, completely ignored by the massive wall of photographers. Once inside the sprawling, opulent ballroom, they desperately tried to insert themselves into circles of executives Mark used to consider his peers. But Hollywood is ruthless, and the smell of failure is highly contagious. The executives offered them tight, uncomfortable smiles before immediately turning their backs. Quickly realizing they were absolute pariahs, they were relegated to a cramped, poorly lit table in the absolute back corner of the cavernous room, right next to the kitchen doors. They sat in the shadows, watching from a humiliating distance as the real power players drank vintage Dom Perignon and celebrated their success. Chloe was vibrating with toxic envy, grinding her teeth, while Mark aggressively chugged Freewell drinks, desperately trying to numb the agonizing realization that he was a total nobody in the very room he used to own. While they marinated in their misery, David and I bypassed the red carpet entirely. We arrived via a secure subterranean loading dock beneath the arena, flanked by Artie and a phalanx of burly, earpiece-wearing private security guards. Not a single person in the press corps knew I was in the building. I was ushered into the grand headliner's dressing room, a massive, opulent suite reserved exclusively for the icons of the night. I sat on a plush sofa, staring at the live feed of the ballroom on the security monitors. My heart hammered a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. I watched the crowd. I saw the critics who had written me off. And finally, the camera panned across the back of the room. My eyes locked onto monitor screen number 3. There they were, Mark and Chloe. Huddled in the dark corner, looking miserable, bitter, and entirely oblivious to the Category 5 hurricane that was currently hurtling toward them. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. Artie stepped into the room, holding a sleek, custom-made, solid gold microphone. He handed it to me. It felt heavy in my palm, like a true weapon of war. "It's time, Ella," he said, his voice thick with genuine emotion. "The stage is yours. Go burn the house down." Out in the arena, the legendary actor hosting the telecast walked out to the center of the massive stage. The night was peaking. He raised his hands, demanding silence from the thousands of tipsy, chattering celebrities in the room. The lights dimmed slightly, and his deep, authoritative voice boomed through the state-of-the-art PA system, commanding the attention of the millions watching on live television. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone dropping into something solemn and electric. "Tonight is a night of celebration, of handing out trophies and honoring the art that defines our culture. But occasionally, this stage becomes the site of a truly historic resurrection." A confused, excited murmur rippled across the tables. "We have guarded a secret for months," the host continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "The artist who is about to step onto this stage requires absolutely no introduction. When she suddenly vanished, she left an unfillable void in the soul of American music. The press told you she was broken. The rumors said the silence had claimed her forever." He paused, letting the tension stretch until it was almost unbearable. "But true greatness cannot be silenced. Like a phoenix from the ashes, she has returned. Please welcome back to the stage, the voice of our generation, Eleanor Vance." The massive arena plunged into pitch-black darkness. A collective gasp, followed by a chaotic hum of shock and bewilderment, swept through the cavernous space. People were dropping their forks, grabbing their phones. From my position beneath the stage, I took one final massive breath. I filled my lungs with the air of a brand new life, stepped onto the hydraulic lift, and gave the stage manager the nod. A solitary, haunting piano chord ripped through the darkness. It was a heavy, melancholic sound, the intro to my new lead single. Slowly, a single, blinding white spotlight cut straight down from the rafters, illuminating a tight circle in the exact center of the stage. As the hydraulic lift locked into place and I stepped out into that pillar of blinding light, the entire arena stopped breathing. I stood there in my blood-red gown, shimmering like an untouchable goddess, gripping the gold microphone with the supreme, terrifying confidence of an emperor returning from exile. For 5 agonizingly long seconds, there was no applause, just stunned, paralyzed shock. Thousands of the most famous people in the world sat with their mouths hanging open. I raised the microphone to my lips. I closed my eyes, tapped into the deepest well of pain and triumph within me, and unleashed the opening vocal line. My voice exploded through the towering arena speakers. It wasn't the fragile, pretty pop voice they remembered. It was a staggering, earth-shaking roar of pure emotion. The tone was so rich, so agonizingly powerful, that it vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the ribcages of every person in the room. I sang about betrayal in the dark. I sang about the suffocating weight of being buried alive by the people you trusted. And I sang about clawing your way out of the grave, covered in dirt, ready to rain down hellfire. The physical impact on the audience was catastrophic. Hardened record executives were covering their mouths. Megastars in the front rows had tears streaming down their meticulously made-up faces. They were witnessing a literal miracle, a woman who had allegedly lost her voice forever, standing before them and singing with the power of a divine being. But back in the darkest, furthest corner of the room, at the loser's table by the kitchen doors, the effect was infinitely more destructive. Mark, who had been halfway through lifting a glass of cheap bourbon to his lips, froze entirely. His brain simply snapped. The glass slipped from his trembling, numb fingers, shattering against the table, splashing amber liquid all over the white tablecloth. His face, illuminated by the flashing stage lights, looked like a decaying corpse. His eyes bulged out of his skull in sheer, unadulterated horror. He stared at the stage, as if he were looking at the Grim Reaper himself. He couldn't process it. His Ella, the woman he had relentlessly abused, the woman he had laughed at, the woman he had discarded as a broken, useless toy, was standing on the biggest stage in the world, radiating an untouchable majesty, delivering a vocal performance that he, the so-called genius producer, had never been able to coax out of her. Chloe, sitting rigidly beside him, clapped both of her hands over her mouth, stifling a shrill shriek of terror. All the bitter envy and desperate ambition that fueled her pathetic life instantly morphed into paralyzing, physical fear. Staring at me in my red gown, basking in the light, she realized exactly how microscopic and worthless she truly was in the grand scheme of the universe. Halfway through the second verse, I opened my eyes. As if guided by a laser targeting system, my gaze cut through the darkness, past the billionaires and the pop stars, directly to the back table where those 2 rats were cowering in absolute panic. As I hit the song's epic, soaring bridge holding a high, impossibly perfect note that brought half the room to their feet, I locked eyes with Mark. It was a cold, dead, executioner's stare. It was a look of such immense, crushing superiority that Mark physically flinched. He dropped his head, staring at the spilled bourbon on the table, totally incapable of holding my gaze, shrinking into his threadbare suit like the pathetic, cowardly worm he had always been. He knew, with terrifying certainty, that every single lyric of this song, which was currently being broadcast live to 50 million people, was a direct, very public indictment of his soul. Then I shifted my gaze to the front row. There, standing tall amidst a crowd of seated celebrities, was David, my incredible husband. The man who had picked me up off the floor when I had nothing left. His eyes were shining with tears of pure pride and overwhelming love. I offered him a tiny, secret smile and poured everything I had left into the final, triumphant chorus. I ended the performance on an a cappella high note that defied the limits of human vocal cords. The note hung in the air for a second, crystal clear, before I lowered the microphone and bowed my head. The arena didn't just applaud, it exploded. It was a deafening, terrifying roar of human adulation. 10,000 people leaped to their feet simultaneously, screaming my name, throwing their hands in the air, offering a frantic, hysterical standing ovation to the greatest comeback in music history. I stood in the center of the light, breathing in the sweet, intoxicating oxygen of total victory, knowing with immense satisfaction that for my traitors, the real nightmare was just beginning. The standing ovation felt like it was never going to end. The thunderous roar of the crowd washed over me, a tidal sonic wave that obliterated the last lingering shadows of my trauma. I stood there, soaking in the blinding heat of the spotlights, feeling every broken piece of my soul finally snap perfectly back into place. Artie Carmichael strode out onto the stage, beaming like a proud father. He grabbed my hand and raised it high into the air as the crowd went entirely feral. He pulled a microphone to his mouth, and with a voice dripping with corporate swagger, he announced to the world that my new album had just surprise dropped on all streaming platforms at midnight, and it had already shattered the first-hour streaming records on Apple Music and Spotify. He announced my exclusive global deal. He revealed that his team had spent the last 6 months secretly routing an exhaustive 70-city global arena tour under a fake project name, and that tickets were going on sale right this second. Every single word Artie spoke was another heavy steel nail driven violently into Mark's professional coffin. As the telecast cut to a commercial break, I glided off the stage, my head held incredibly high, walking straight toward the ultra-exclusive VIP winner's circle behind the main stage. David was waiting for me at the bottom of the exit ramp. He bypassed protocol, stepped past the security detail, and pulled me into a crushing, desperate embrace, lifting my feet off the ground. He kissed me with a fierce, possessive tenderness. "You did it, my love," he whispered against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. "You absolutely destroyed them." Together, hand in hand, we walked into the VIP lounge. It was a Shark Tank of industry titans. The moment I entered, the room erupted into applause again. Billionaire executives, A-list actors, and rival pop stars lined up just to shake my hand, to frantically apologize for ever doubting me, and to pathetically beg for writing collaborations. I smiled graciously, sipping a glass of extremely rare champagne, maintaining the cool, unbothered posture of an untouchable queen. But I knew the night wasn't officially over until I dealt with the trash. I didn't have to wait long. Fueled by a lethal, toxic cocktail of cheap liquor, extreme humiliation, and desperate delusion, Mark had somehow managed to bribe or sneak his way past the outer security perimeter of the VIP area. He came stumbling through the velvet ropes, practically dragging Chloe by her wrist. She was tripping over her cheap heels, her face a mask of sheer terror as she realized they were intruding on a room filled with people who could destroy them with a single phone call. Mark, his face a sweaty, flushed mess, his tie completely undone, shoved his way past a group of glaring journalists until he was standing just 10 feet away from David and me. The gentle ambient music of the VIP lounge seemed to screech to a halt. The incredibly wealthy, powerful people surrounding us went dead silent, stepping back to watch the train wreck. Everyone in Hollywood knew the vicious rumors about the divorce, but seeing the washed-up, desperate ex-husband crash the triumphant diva's victory party was premium. Front-row drama. "Ella!" Mark shouted. His voice was high-pitched, manic, and incredibly pathetic as he tried to project an air of authority that he no longer possessed. "Ella, I knew you could do it. I knew your voice wasn't dead. I built you, Ella. I taught you how to project like that. You have to talk to me. We need to get back in the studio together." The sheer, staggering audacity of his words caused several high-powered A&R reps nearby to literally laugh out loud in disbelief. David immediately tensed beside me, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. He stepped forward to intercept Mark, fully prepared to physically throw the man out of the building for disrespecting my space. But I reached out and placed a gentle, calming hand flat against my husband's solid chest. I didn't need a knight in shining armor to fight this battle. I had my voice back, and I was going to wield it with the ruthless precision of a surgeon's scalpel. I took one slow, deliberate step toward Mark. The physical contrast between us was staggering. I was draped in custom silk and millions of dollars of diamonds, surrounded by an impenetrable fortress of respect and genuine love. He was sweating through a cheap suit, reeking of desperation and well whiskey, desperately clutching the hand of a terrified mistress who looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. I looked him slowly up and down, my face registering nothing but a profound, clinical disgust. It was the exact same pity he had claimed to feel for me on that studio recording. "Mark," I said. My voice was calm, icy, and projected so perfectly that it cut through the silence of the massive room like a whip. "You didn't build me. You were simply a grotesque, overpriced toll I had to pay to learn what kind of parasite I never want in my life again. My voice belongs to me. My talent belongs to me. And this empire? I built it directly on top of the pathetic little ruins you left behind when you tried to break me." Chloe, buckling under the crushing pressure of 100 elite industry, stares burning holes into her cheap dress, tried to intervene. She thought she could play the victim one last time. "Ella, please," she sobbed, her voice a grating, fake whine. "We're completely broke. We have nowhere else to go. The label is dropping us. Please, just forgive us." I slowly turned my gaze to her. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lose my temper. I maintained an aura of absolute, terrifying serenity. "Chloe," I replied, my tone dropping to a sub-zero temperature. "You got exactly what you worked so hard for. I handed you the man of your dreams on a silver platter. You should be thrilled. Now, choke on the consequences of what you stole." Artie, who had been watching the exchange with deep, visible revulsion, gave a subtle, sharp nod to the massive head of arena security standing by the door. In less than 3 seconds, 4 hulking men in black suits descended on Mark and Chloe. "Get this absolute garbage out of my VIP room," Artie barked, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "And make sure their names are permanently blacklisted from every single security gate at my label. They will never set foot in this industry again." Mark tried to physically resist, thrashing wildly, screaming incoherent obscenities and cursing my name as the massive security guards grabbed him by the armpits and violently dragged him backward. Chloe was sobbing hysterically, completely humiliated, her cheap stilettos snapping as she was unceremoniously hauled toward the exit doors. They became the absolute laughingstock of the entire Hollywood elite, an embarrassing sideshow being thrown out with the rest of the trash. We all watched them disappear down the long, dark corridor, permanently expelled from the paradise they had so foolishly taken for granted. I turned my back on the exit, picked up my crystal flute of champagne, and raised it toward David and Artie. The VIP room erupted into a fresh, raucous round of applause and cheers, celebrating not just my musical triumph, but the flawless, brutal execution of undeniable karma. When the sun rose over Los Angeles the next morning, the entire country woke up with my name on their lips. Every major news outlet, every morning talk show, and every pop culture blog was dominated by my staggering return. "The Phoenix of Pop," read the headline of the LA Times. "The greatest comeback in modern music," declared Rolling Stone. David sat across from me on the sun-drenched balcony of our Malibu home, reading the glowing reviews aloud as we drank our morning coffee. The sound of the Pacific waves crashing below us. My album, released at midnight, had already hit #1 in 40 different countries. Every major radio station from New York to LA was playing my lead single on an endless loop, the exact same song that had paralyzed Mark with terror the night before. And while I sat there, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, surrounded by unimaginable peace, love, and global success, the final, apocalyptic storm made landfall on the miserable lives of my betrayers. The public humiliation Mark and Chloe suffered at the gala was the final, fatal blow to their toxic codependency. The few remaining industry doors that Mark had been desperately scratching at were slammed shut and welded locked. Artie kept his promise. Mark's name became an industry-wide joke, a cautionary tale of arrogance and catastrophic failure. That very same morning, the bank, having seen the viral TMZ video of Mark being thrown out of the gala and realizing his career was definitively over-executed, the massive eviction and repossession orders Mark had been dodging for months. Sheriff's deputies arrived at their dingy Van Nuys apartment complex. The scene that unfolded, later leaked by a neighbor on TikTok, was a masterpiece of squalor. Chloe, still wearing the smeared, tear-stained makeup and the ripped sequin dress from the night before, shrieked hysterically on the sidewalk as deputies dragged their cheap IKEA furniture out onto the curb. Mark's leased BMW, the absolute last desperate symbol of his fake Hollywood status, was hooked up to a tow truck, while the entire apartment complex watched and laughed. Extreme poverty has a brutal way of incinerating fake love. Stripped of his money, his power, and his reputation, Mark was entirely useless to Chloe. Standing on the hot California pavement surrounded by garbage bags full of their clothes, Chloe finally unleashed her true, venomous nature. She turned on Mark with the ferocity of a rabid animal. She threw her cheap knockoff handbag directly into his face and screamed, at the top of her lungs, that he was a pathetic, impotent failure who had destroyed her life. She viciously reminded him that if he hadn't been so monumentally stupid as to leave the studio microphones hot that afternoon, they would be sitting in a Calabasas mansion right now, living off my millions. Mark, utterly broken and humiliated beyond repair, grabbed her arm and told her to shut her mouth. Chloe responded by winding up and slapping him across the face so hard the sound echoed down the street. She looked at him with the exact same visceral disgust he had once claimed to feel for me. Then, without a single backward glance, she turned on her heel and marched down the sidewalk, leaving him completely abandoned, sitting on a curb next to a pile of cardboard boxes, weeping like the cowardly, broken little boy he had always been. While Mark hit the absolute rock bottom of human existence, my life with David soared into the stratosphere. The massive influx of capital from my new record deal didn't just secure my legacy, it built David's dream. David, an incredibly brilliant and hardworking man, took the investment capital and launched his own high-end construction and acoustic design firm in Los Angeles, hiring a team of top-tier architects to bring his visions to life. He was no longer the guy doing grunt work for other contractors. He was the CEO of an elite firm, designing state-of-the-art recording studios and performance spaces for the biggest names in entertainment. We were the ultimate Hollywood power couple, an invincible team that had taken the toxic ashes of our pasts and forged an empire of mutual respect. At night, after grueling, 12-hour tour rehearsals, I would come home to find David cooking dinner, ready to rub my exhausted shoulders and remind me, with fierce sincerity, how deeply he loved me. The ensuing months were a whirlwind of intense labor and profound satisfaction. Rehearsing with my new band felt like literal magic. My voice responded with a power, agility, and docility that constantly moved me to tears of gratitude. The public didn't just love me as a pop star anymore. They revered me as a symbol of feminine resilience, unbreakable dignity, and survival. I had transmuted my deepest personal trauma into a beacon of hope for millions of women worldwide, and that was worth more to me than every Grammy in the vault. I was just days away from kicking off my massive, sold-out global arena tour. But the universe, with its brilliant, razor-sharp sense of irony, had arranged one final, poetic encounter, a definitive closure that would prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that karma never, ever misses an address. It was a crisp, brilliantly sunny Tuesday morning in Los Angeles. We were just 2 weeks out from opening night of the tour. I decided to take a rare morning off to accompany David to the soft opening of his firm's most prestigious architectural triumph to date. David's company had been personally commissioned by a private consortium of billionaire investors to completely gut and restore an iconic, historic theater in downtown LA, a magnificent 1920s movie palace that had been abandoned for decades. David had personally redesigned the entire acoustic infrastructure to make it the most sonically perfect performance venue on the West Coast. And, as a breathtakingly romantic gesture that made me sob, he had successfully convinced the private board of directors to rename the Grand Main Hall, the Eleanor Vance Auditorium. We pulled up to the historic theater in the back of a sleek black Escalade. I was wearing a chic tailored camel coat over a white silk blouse, my eyes hidden behind oversized Tom Ford sunglasses to ward off the blinding California sun. A small gaggle of architectural photographers and local press were waiting by the entrance. David slipped his strong arm around my waist, guiding me through the flashbulbs with the calm, protective authority I adored. We stepped inside the cavernous, breathtaking lobby of the theater. Dozens of construction workers and union laborers were scrambling frantically, applying the final coats of paint, polishing the brass fixtures, and cleaning the marble floors before the mayor arrived for the ribbon cutting. The smell of fresh plaster, cut mahogany, and industrial cleaner filled the air. David was passionately explaining the complex acoustic baffling he had installed in the vaulted ceiling as we walked down the grand, marble-floored hallway. Suddenly, a loud, violent crash echoed through the corridor. A heavy, 50-pound bag of industrial cement had been dropped on the pristine marble floor, bursting open and sending a thick, choking cloud of gray dust into the air right in front of us. The site foreman yelled down from a nearby scaffolding, furiously berating the clumsy day laborer who had ruined the newly polished floor. The worker, dressed in filthy, paint-splattered jeans and a torn neon orange safety vest, his back severely hunched from exhaustion, scrambled frantically to his knees, trying to scoop up the heavy, toxic dust with his bare, shaking hands. David, ever the compassionate leader, stepped forward and asked in his deep, resonant voice if the man was injured. Hearing David's voice, the filthy laborer froze. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his head. As the gray dust settled and the bright morning sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows hit his face, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. It was him. It was Mark, the untouchable, multi-millionaire record producer. The man who used to scream at assistants if his matcha latte wasn't exactly 140 degrees. The man who wore custom Italian suits and flew private to Aspen. There he was. On his hands and knees in the dirt, his face was deeply lined, aged 20 years in the span of 12 months. His hands, which used to effortlessly slide faders on $1 million soundboard, were now cracked, bleeding, and caked in dry cement. His eyes were the hollow, dead eyes of a man who has been entirely chewed up and spat out by his own catastrophic hubris. The poetic justice was so flawless it felt scripted. Mark, the man who had viciously mocked David for having the rough, dirty hands of a construction worker, was now a bottom-tier, minimum-wage day laborer, working for the highly successful, multi-million-dollar architectural firm that my husband owned. Mark stared up at me, and then his gaze shifted to David. Absolute, paralyzing horror washed over his filthy face. His eyes, framed by dark, sunken bags and cement dust, reflected a shame so profound, so agonizingly deep, that for a fraction of a microsecond, I almost felt a pang of pity for him. He scrambled desperately to stand up, but his legs were trembling so violently he had to slump back against the freshly painted drywall just to stay upright. David, demonstrating a level of class and restraint that proved exactly why he was the better man, didn't gloat. He didn't sneer. He didn't drop a single cruel remark. He simply looked down at Mark with the calm, detached authority of a CEO looking at an incompetent stranger who had made a mess on his floor. I reached up and slowly pulled off my dark sunglasses. I looked Mark dead in the eyes. There was no blazing hatred left in my heart. There was no anger. I didn't feel the slightest urge to scream at him or demand apologies. I felt absolutely, unequivocally nothing. Looking at him was like looking at a broken piece of furniture on the side of the highway. And in that moment, I realized I had achieved the ultimate, final victory over my abuser. Complete, untouchable indifference. Mark opened his mouth. His lips trembled. Perhaps he was going to beg for his pathetic job, terrified that David would fire him on the spot and leave him to starve on the streets of LA. Perhaps he wanted to finally apologize. But no sound came out. His voice, the arrogant, booming voice that had cruelly laughed at my paralysis in the recording booth, completely failed him. He was suffocating under the crushing, inescapable weight of his own monumental failure. David turned away from the trembling shell of a man. With a perfectly professional tone, he instructed the site foreman to get a cleaning crew to fix the mess before the press entered the hallway. He didn't even acknowledge Mark's existence. Then, my incredible husband turned back to me, his eyes softening instantly. He offered me his arm, smiled with infinite tenderness, and asked if I was ready to see the stage he had built for me. I smiled back, my heart swelling with an ocean of love. I slipped my arm through his, and without a single backward glance, we walked away. We left Mark kneeling in the toxic dust of his ruined life, a pathetic ghost of a past that no longer had any power over me. As my heels clicked confidently against the marble floor, echoing through the grand corridors, I felt the final, heavy iron chain fall away from my soul. I was entirely free. The opening night of my world tour finally arrived. The atmosphere inside the newly christened Eleanor Vance Auditorium in downtown Los Angeles was nothing short of electric. Sitting in my luxurious, custom-designed dressing room, surrounded by vanity mirrors and the quiet hum of my elite glam squad perfecting my look, I demanded 5 minutes of complete privacy. The room cleared out, leaving me alone with my reflection. The woman staring back at me in the glass was unrecognizable from the terrified, voiceless victim who had once cowered in the shadows of a Calabasas mansion. I was an unstoppable force of nature, a queen sitting firmly on a throne built from resilience, talent, and authentic love. I was wearing a custom-designed midnight blue Oscar de la Renta gown, hand-embroidered with thousands of Swarovski crystals that caught the light like a galaxy of stars. I felt bulletproof. Just before call time, Artie Carmichael pushed open the dressing room door. He was carrying a massive bouquet of long-stemmed white roses. He enveloped me in a massive bear hug and whispered that the streets of downtown LA outside the theater were completely gridlocked. Thousands of fans who couldn't score tickets had flooded the blocks just to be near the building, holding candlelight vigils and singing my songs in the streets. As Artie spoke, my mind flashed briefly to a piece of industry gossip a makeup artist had dropped earlier that week. Chloe had been spotted working the graveyard shift as a cocktail waitress in a notoriously sleazy dive bar out in the desert near Barstow. She was serving cheap beers to aggressive, handsy truckers who treated her with the exact same vile disrespect she had once shown everyone else. She had aged terribly, entirely consumed by the bitter, rotting reality that she had traded a good, honest husband for a fleeting fantasy that dumped her in the gutter. Hearing that didn't bring me joy, but it closed the final ledger. I didn't have to destroy her. The universe had handled the execution flawlessly. David slipped into the room just as Artie left. My husband looked breathtaking in his tailored suit, his eyes shining with that familiar, soul-melting pride. He walked over, took both of my hands in his, and kissed my forehead with absolute reverence. "This is your kingdom, Ella," he said, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the chaos of the night. "Go out there and remind the world why they never should have counted you out. I'll be right in the front row, cheering louder than anyone else." I nodded, blinking back happy tears so I wouldn't ruin my makeup. I took a deep, centering breath, pushed open the dressing room door, and began the long walk down the heavily guarded backstage corridor toward the stage. The roar of the sold-out crowd bleeding through the massive acoustic walls sounded like a literal hurricane. When I climbed the short staircase and took my position behind the heavy, crimson velvet curtain, I felt the bass from the crowd's chanting vibrating through the soles of my shoes. The house lights snapped off. The arena was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, firefly glow of 5,000 cell phone cameras. The heavy curtain slowly parted. The opening synth chords of my anthem of survival washed over the crowd. A massive, brilliant white spotlight hit me dead center. The sheer volume of the screaming crowd was so physically overwhelming, I thought the roof of the historic theater was going to rip clean off. People were weeping openly, holding up illuminated signs with messages of fierce love and solidarity. I brought the custom gold microphone to my lips. I closed my eyes, planted my feet firmly on the stage my husband had built, and let my voice soar. It was flawless, powerful, resonant, and entirely liberated. I sang with a ferocity that bordered on the spiritual, pouring every ounce of my past agony and present joy into the microphone. The connection with the audience was visceral. I looked out into the crowd and saw thousands of women who had been silenced, cheated on, underestimated, and abused in their own lives, screaming the lyrics back at me like an army of invincible warriors marching to war. During the bridge, I opened my eyes and looked straight down into the front row. David was standing exactly where he promised he would be. He was looking up at me with an adoration so pure and absolute it practically glowed in the dark. He was my rock, my sanctuary, and the ultimate reward at the end of a very long, very dark road. As the final, triumphant chords of the song rang out into the night, and the blinding applause washed over me like a baptism, I realized the ultimate truth about revenge. The greatest, most devastating revenge you can ever inflict upon your abusers isn't screaming at them. It isn't tearing their lives apart with your own hands. The most agonizing punishment for a traitor is forcing them to sit in the cold, pathetic squalor of their own making, and watch from the shadows as the person they tried to destroy rises up, shining infinitely brighter, stronger, and happier than they ever were. The tour was a monumental, record-breaking success. In every city from Chicago to Miami, women would wait by my tour bus, not for selfies, but to whisper, "Thank you, Ella. Watching you survive gave me the courage to walk out of my own nightmare." Over the years, Mark and Chloe completely faded from existence. Not because they died, but because their relevance to the world, and to my mind, dropped to absolute zero. The last rumor I heard was that Mark was living in a rented trailer in Nevada, completely alienated from the industry, drowning in the bitter reality that he had thrown away a kingdom for a piece of trash. Chloe remained trapped in her desert dive bar, forever haunted by the billboards of my face towering over the highways. That was their life sentence. Waking up every single day knowing that I won, not because I destroyed them, but because I bloomed. Today, as I sit on the sun-drenched wooden deck of our Malibu beach house, holding a mug of organic tea and listening to the rhythmic crash of the Pacific Ocean, I look over at David. He is sitting at the patio table, reviewing the architectural blueprints for a new concert hall his firm is building, the California sun catching the silver in his hair. My voice is stronger than it has ever been. It is anchored by a deep, emotional maturity that can only be forged by turning profound agony into high art. I learned the hard way that betrayal is not the end of your story. It is a violent crossroads. You can either let the trauma rip out your vocal cords and force you into silence, or you can step up to the mic and sing louder than you ever have before. I chose to sing. I chose to risk loving a good man. And most importantly, I chose to forgive myself for ever trusting the monsters in the first place. Life is a grand, terrifyingly beautiful stage. And you are the only one who gets to decide what song you are going to sing.